Welcome to the first bonus video of week 1, editing with Adobe Camera Raw. Hey, I want to set you up for success. Let's set up your Camera Raw preferences. There are a few places we can go to do this. Trust me, they all point to the same location no matter where you go to set them. Let me show you what I mean. The most complicated place to set your preferences for Adobe Camera Raw is Lightroom. Let's look. Let's go to Lightroom. I'm on a Mac. My preferences are under the Lightroom Classic panel. If you're on a PC, your Camera Raw preferences will be found under the Edit menu on the Windows platform. I'm going to go look at Preferences under Lightroom Classic on the Mac. And the reason this is much more complicated in Lightroom is because they explode the various settings for Camera Raw into different locations. Here's a General tab. I have a Presets tab where I can set my specific Camera Raw settings per camera. You'll notice it's done here. External editing. When I open a file from Lightroom into Photoshop, for example, PSD, Photoshop, open as a PSD with these settings. These aren't necessarily right or wrong settings for you. I'm just showing you now where to set Camera Raw prefs. File handling. Please use my DNGs, embed fast load data, all these kinds of things. They're exploded throughout the Lightroom prefs. And therefore, I'm going to say, don't set your Camera Raw prefs in Lightroom. Even for Lightroom, it's more complicated there than it needs to be. What you could do is set your Camera Raw prefs inside Photoshop. I'll show you that next. In Photoshop, Preferences. Again, if you're on a PC, your preferences will be found under the Edit menu. Here I'm at Photoshop, Preferences, and there's something called File Handling. There it is. File Handling. And under File Handling, there's a little button, right in the middle, Camera Raw Preferences. And I'm going to tap that, and I want you to notice what shows up in this panel, nice and organized. These were 5 different places that we had to go locate in Lightroom. They're all together, nice and organized here if you do this from Photoshop. So come to Photoshop if you want. It's still not my favorite. Photoshop menu, Preferences on the Mac, come over to File Handling, and you can set these camera specific settings. We talked about that. DNGs. There's your settings. There's my camera specifics. And when I open a file into Photoshop, what will they open as? This is where I said in Lightroom, this is not necessarily right or wrong for you. I just want you to see that the same things. If you set them in Lightroom, you're set. If you set them in Photoshop here, you're set. Let me cancel. Cancel. Quit. And come over to our dear friend, Bridge. Again, PC users, look under the Edit menu for Camera Raw prefs. Mac users, Adobe Bridge, Camera Raw prefs. I'm going to open what is going to look like the same exact panel we saw in Photoshop. Start to notice that when you edit Adobe Camera Raw in Bridge or in Photoshop, they look the same. The interfaces are the same. They're only different in Lightroom. It becomes a burr under my saddle that Lightroom doesn't look the way it does on the others. I've gone to the Camera Raw prefs right there, plain and simple from Bridge's menu, and it takes me straight to that location I had some trouble finding in Photoshop. Exactly the same settings. Here's where I will set my Camera Raw prefs. Now let's talk about the Camera Raw prefs. When I'm editing in Adobe Camera Raw, I've only made a couple of changes to the defaults. My edit panel behavior, you'll thank me if you'll set that from the default to responsive. I'm going to tell you why I like responsive. Single says when you open the basic panel, only open it. When you go to open another panel, curves, for example, which you'll learn about, it opens curves, but it closes the basic panel. It's only allowing one single panel to show at a time. That's not that helpful to me if I have more screen real estate that I could be spending. The reverse is true, and just as much of a nuisance to me with multiple. It will always show me multiple panels, even when I've run out of room, and I'll have to scroll up and down in order to find what I'm looking for. Therefore, I don't like that. Responsive is my favorite because you'll see if I open a panel and I need another panel and I have room for it, it opens it too. And when I open a third, if I have room for it, it opens all three. If I open a fourth and it doesn't have room, it closes the one I started with. So it's constantly responding to which panels I have open, how much space they take, and how much display area on my computer screen I have. That's it. I prefer it. You might also. Another thing we're going to want to do in the camera raw preferences, by the way, again, if I set them here, I've also set them under Lightroom and Photoshop, is to use the compact layout. Now, you don't have to do that. It just makes all your words and your panels a little bit more efficient. They're smaller, therefore they may be harder to read. I don't have that problem with my super cool tools on right here. So I prefer to have a more compact, efficient looking layout. All it does, if you turn that off, is adds space between the lines. That's really what I've turned on here. Now, there's something called Rich Tooltips. I've turned it off. The first couple of times you use Camera Raw, it may be useful that as you hover over your tools, a little video pops up letting you know what those things are. Those videos are Rich Tooltips. At some point, I grow weary of them. The novelty wears right off. I've turned that off eventually. Now, I showed you this earlier when we were examining on the first lessons video about how to change your orientation of your film strip if you had more than one image open at the same time in Camera Raw. Are your thumbnails going to show up vertically, or will they show up along the bottom horizontally? The default is horizontal. I've changed mine to vertical. It's all your call. And once you're in Camera Raw, you can make that change at will, at your whim and desire. That's the only changes I've made in that first panel. If you have questions about anything else in there, study up or ask me and I'll answer it for you via email. File handling is important. DNG file handling. We will learn to save or convert our raw files into DNG. So set it to this. Ignore sidecar XMP files. That's what you want. Be sure that you update embedded JPEG previews to not the default, which is medium size, rather full size. It takes more hard drive space, but it gives you a more beautiful, a more accurate display of your image when you're looking at it at full screen view. If you don't set this to full screen, your images will look softer on screen than they really are. JPEG, HEIC, and TIFF. This can be whatever you want. This is basically me saying whenever I see a JPEG and I double click it, should it open with Camera Raw or with Photoshop, which is usually the default, I'm saying automatically open all supported JPEGs and HEICs in Camera Raw rather than Photoshop. That's not very wise, honestly. But if I have edited a JPEG, a HEIC with Camera Raw one time, if I've gone out of my way to do that, then automatically open it when I double click it next time, because it notices that it's got Adobe Camera Raw settings embedded in it. Automatically open JPEGs and HEICs with settings. If settings have been found in a pre-edited image, it will reopen in Adobe Camera Raw. The top item says don't ever open JPEGs or HEICs in Adobe Camera Raw. It's not a bad choice either. I think the worst choice is the bottom choice. Sometimes Rick Burris does edit a JPEG or a HEIC with Adobe Camera Raw, but I go out of my way to pick it, choose it, open it in Camera Raw. It's never a default double click choice. And therefore I use the middle one, the one that's currently selected. Performance. Wow, this is tough. You cannot do what I've done here, most probably. It's up to how much RAM you have. How much computer IQ have you purchased and plugged into your computer? Now, I have 64 megabytes of RAM on my computer, and I have an 8 terabyte internal solid state hard drive. 8 terabytes. Therefore, I have plenty of room to waste 200 gigabytes worth on something called the Camera Raw cache. If you have a 4 terabyte internal hard drive, set this value to 100. If you have a 2 terabyte drive, set this number to 50. If you have a 1 terabyte drive, set this number to 25. Don't just set yours to 200 unless you have an 8 terabyte internal hard drive. You'll run out of hard drive space. The cache makes computer run faster in Camera Raw. So the more you could add to this value, the faster generally you would become, but there's a catch, there's a trade-off with hard drive space. Available hard drive space is the cost for the speed that you're requiring. Raw defaults, we'll talk more about this later. You're not ready to set this yet. I'm going to show you how to create presets in Adobe Camera Raw later. And once we've created some presets, some automatic choices for all kinds of things we might choose to do, then we can come back here into the raw defaults and say, whenever you recognize an image shot with my camera, please do choose this preset that I've set up. I'm going to show you how to save presets, custom presets, and then we'll come back here and we'll set up your global preset for your camera type. Workflow. Workflow is fascinating. This is one of the many ways to get to workflow. Workflow is just a big what if. What if I'm editing a photo in Adobe Camera Raw and then I want to take that image, that baby, into the jungle? What will happen if I take my baby from Adobe Camera Raw into the jungle? This is what will happen. This is not changing anything about the photo as it currently sits in Adobe Camera Raw. It's not a do it to it right now. It's a what if I open it in the jungle. With that in mind, if I were to open one of these photos from Adobe Camera Raw into Photoshop, it would change the color space for me. Now, you may not know what this means, and that's okay with me too, but the default is this, sRGB, and that's a tiny itty-bitty little color space. Put it this way, it's a small box of crayons. There aren't a lot of crayons in that box, but that's what Photoshop does to you by default. It throws away all the colors that were in your image. It's destructive. So if you don't know anything else, you may just want to set your workflow to Adobe RGB 1998. It's a larger color space. It will not be harmed if you open this in Photoshop. That's the only thing I would really do now. That's the only thing I would do now. Now, I've done some other things, and you're not ready for these yet, probably. I've set my something called bit depth from 8 bits to 16. Now, 16 is a little bit limiting in Photoshop. Not every menu item works on a 16-bit per channel image, but it's much higher quality. That's why I've chosen it. But in the meantime, until you figure out how to use Photoshop, you may want to leave it at 8. This is the Adobe Camera Raw course. But I'm letting you know that it's only what if I open this in Photoshop. For safety, leave it at 8. If you're already an advanced Photoshop stud or studette, you could change it to 16. What if I open an image in Photoshop? Do I want it to resize that image in Photoshop? No, I didn't turn it on. But would you like me to calculate how much data you actually have without losing any data and automatically just set your pixels per inch once you get to Photoshop? This is no harm, no foul if you do this. If you change the resolution, it will not hurt your file. It does not destroy any data in your file on the way over. It will auto adjust the height and or the width of the image so that, boom, it stops at 300 pixels per inch. If I were to set that resolution to 200 pixels per inch, it would just increase the width and the height of my image in Photoshop until it counted 200. Likewise, if I reduce that to 150, it reduces the width and the height. You'll see that happen. Okay? The larger the number here, the smaller the width and the height will be in Photoshop. The larger the resolution is here, just the visually smaller the Photoshop file will look in Photoshop. You can always change that value in Photoshop carefully with jungle training in Photoshop under image menu, image size, change the resolution without the resample box checked. Here it's non-destructive. In Photoshop, beware of the Python. Output sharpening. There's sharpness that occurs when a photo is taken. And there's photo that has to be applied when a photo is output. There's input sharpening. There's output sharpening. They're different. Input sharpening happens in Adobe Camera Raw. I'll show it to you as we work. Output sharpening says, but now I'm going to send it to, for example, matte paper for a print, glossy paper for a print. I'm not going to print. I'm just going to look at it on my screen. You got those choices. What do you print to mostly? I'd make a choice. I never print, then pick screen. And settings. I shudder at too much sharpness. I like accurate sharpness. I love sharpness, but I'm hesitant to set mine at anything over low for now. We'll talk about smart objects. Not only are you becoming one, but Photoshop can automatically import your Camera Raw files as smart objects in Photoshop. It's guaranteed baby protection. That's why I have it on. But Photoshop doesn't behave the way you're used to when you're editing smart objects. So again, for now, you might want that off. In the future, with a little bit more training, you might turn that on. I'm just showing you this is what happens if I open my images in Photoshop. That's all it is. I have an image. Let me show you something. When I edit this image, Command or Control R in Adobe Camera Raw, I'm in the Adobe Camera Raw editor, and I'm going to show you 2 more ways to get to where we've just been. One way is in the top right. There's a little gear inside the Camera Raw editor. There's a little gear. And if I click it, that takes me back to you know where. Again, if I edit it here, it's editing that same space we talked about earlier. I'm just showing you there's another way to get to it. Cancel. At the very bottom of the display area, I introduced you last main lesson to a little film strip thumbnail. A little film strip thumbnail button where you could change it to horizontal and vertical. I just showed you another setting for that in the Camera Raw setup. So there's another way to do that at will, at whim, if you had multiple thumbnails. I don't right now. I'm only working on one image. So there's a way to do that. But also along the bottom, I currently am looking at labels. This red highlight mark represents a label, and stars represent my ratings. But below that is what I want to talk about. It looks like a little hyperlink. And if you click that, it goes straight back into the Camera Raw prefs and hits you right at workflow. So that's another way, yet another way to get there. Now you'll find, and this is advanced, but marvelous, you can make various different combinations of things. You could say I want Adobe RGB at 8-bit and 260 and glossy paper and medium or standard and no smart object. See, I just made a whole new configuration here, haven't I? We'll go back up to the top and we'll say, Rick, a moment ago you started with something, but you just edited it. Click and hold. And you can save it under a new name. Now, look below my cursor. I've already done that. I've already saved lots of different configurations. You don't know why you might want to do that yet, but I'm showing you that you could make a bunch of changes, come up here and create a new one. I like to be kind to myself and give myself easy to remember things. Oh, it was Adobe RGB. How do I know? I'm looking right there on my screen. And it was 8-bit, comma, 8. And it was 260 resolution. I'm typing that. I'm looking. I'm just reading the screen. And it was gloss paper, comma, standard. I'm writing myself a little love note. And at the end of that, I'm going to write, comma, no smart. No smart. I'm talking about my people. I'm going to click OK. And now it has retained that as a preset. Adobe RGB, 8, 260. You get it. Gloss, standard, no smart. So I could quickly change this anytime I want to presets without having to go back and read and double check all those things. Just so you know, the workflow presets are only affecting you. What if I open the image, my baby, in the jungle of Photoshop? The only time these actually affect you. I'm going to say, okay, I told you that was a bit of an advanced trick. Here's something you don't know. Even if you've been already working in an advanced mode in Adobe Camera Raw, down at the bottom in that little workflow setting, if in fact you have saved more than one preset, you receive a free piece of magic. You have to have more than one already created there in workflow presets for this next advanced trick to work. And that is on a 2-button mouse, right click that. Or on a Mac, control key click, not command key, control key click that, and you get a quick view of all of your presets, and you can quickly choose one there. Right click or control key click, and you can quickly choose one there and make changes. That will be useful later. But I wanted to introduce you to that workflow preset because it's a part of the Adobe Camera Raw preset setup. Are we good?